The dilapidated building loomed like a silent sentinel at the edge of the small town, its windows boarded up and its roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. To most, it was just another forgotten structure, an eyesore no one dared to approach. But to Rachel, it was an obsession. For weeks, she had driven past the building on her way home from work, drawn to it by an inexplicable pull. She couldn't shake the thought of the place, the mystery it seemed to harbor behind those rotting walls. Something about it called to her. Rachel had always been intrigued by abandoned places. As a freelance journalist, she specialized in writing about urban legends and ghost stories, and this building, the old Carrington House, had long been a subject of local folklore. It was said to be cursed, abandoned after a series of inexplicable tragedies struck the family who had lived there. Some whispered that the house had a life of its own, that it absorbed the pain and suffering of its occupants, driving them to madness or worse. When Rachel had suggested investigating the house for a new story, her friends had warned her. "Don't go in there, Rach. Everyone who's ever tried has disappeared or gone mad," they'd said. But those warnings only fueled her curiosity. She had to see for herself. There was something about the house that screamed truth to her, like it was waiting to reveal its secrets to the right person. She wasn't afraid. Not yet. The day Rachel decided to enter was colder than usual, the sky overcast with heavy clouds that seemed to mirror her unease. She parked her car across the street, her breath misting in the chilled air. She looked up at the Carrington House, the dark silhouette towering before her, its crumbling facade almost mocking her. The wind whistled through the trees, and for a moment, she considered turning back. The building felt wrong, its very presence unsettling, as if the ground beneath it had absorbed something dark over the years. But Rachel had come this far. She wasn't turning back now. She crossed the overgrown yard, the grass crunching beneath her boots as she approached the front door. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a mix of mildew and something older, something more sinister. Rachel hesitated, staring at the door. The faded brass handle twisted into an eerie shape. She took a deep breath and gripped it, her fingers cold from the contact. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo in the quiet of the street, the hinges protesting after years of disuse. She stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her. The interior was even worse than she had imagined. The air was heavy, thick with dust and the remnants of things left behind. Broken furniture was scattered across the floor, rotting and decaying. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the scent of something sour lingered in the air. Rachel could feel the house pressing in on her, the silence suffocating. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she pushed forward, her flashlight flickering as it illuminated the darkened hallway. She was determined to uncover the truth. The house was said to be haunted by the spirit of a young woman named Lily Carrington, the daughter of the family who had once lived here. Lily had vanished without a trace one cold winter's night, and her disappearance was never solved. The locals claimed that her spirit still haunted the house, waiting for someone to uncover what had really happened. Rachel had to know. She had to understand why this place had such a grip on her. As she walked deeper into the house, the temperature dropped noticeably. Rachel shivered, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, and the sound of her footsteps was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then, just as she rounded a corner, she froze. In the distance, at the end of the hallway, a figure stood motionless. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, her hair hanging limply around her face. Her eyes, wide and hollow, stared at Rachel as if she had been waiting for her. The figure was barely visible, a shadow in the dim light, but Rachel felt her presence like a cold hand gripping her chest. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. "Lily?" Rachel whispered, the name escaping her lips without thinking. The figure's head tilted slightly, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, the woman took a step forward. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest, the pulse in her ears deafening as she watched the figure move. The woman's footsteps were silent, as if she were gliding across the floor rather than walking. Rachel wanted to scream, to turn and flee, but her feet remained glued to the ground. The woman's hollow eyes locked onto hers, her expression unreadable, yet there was a flicker of recognition in them. Something familiar, like Rachel had seen her before, but she couldn't place where or when. The figure took another slow step toward her, and Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't look away, couldn't tear her gaze from those wide, vacant eyes. A cold draft swept through the hall, and for a moment, Rachel felt like the temperature had dropped far below freezing. Her fingers ached from the chill, and her body trembled as she fought the urge to run. "What do you want?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The woman didn't speak. She simply continued to move forward, her movements stiff and unnatural. It was as though she were bound to some invisible force, tethered to the house, to the very air in which they stood. Rachel took a cautious step backward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam of light flickered as if it, too, was afraid of what lay ahead. The woman, or the spirit of Lily Carrington, took another step. But this time, Rachel noticed something that made her stomach drop. The woman's feet didn't touch the ground. She hovered inches above it, her ghostly form barely making a sound. A chill swept over Rachel as the realization hit her. This wasn't just any ghost. This was something more powerful, more malevolent. Lily's eyes burned with an intensity that sent a wave of dread through Rachel's core, and she felt a sudden urge to turn and run. But something about the figure kept her rooted in place. Her mind clouded with the need to understand, to unravel the mystery that had drawn her here in the first place. "Please." Rachel's voice faltered as she spoke again, her words barely a whisper. "What happened to you? Why are you here?" The spirit's lips parted, but no sound came from them. Instead, a cold, hollow voice echoed through Rachel's mind, not through the air, but within her thoughts. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was soft, like a breath of wind brushing against her ear, but it carried a weight of sorrow and rage that made Rachel's blood run cold. The words lingered in her mind, echoing in the darkness, and Rachel's breath quickened as the woman's image began to flicker like a broken television screen. One moment she was there, standing eerily still. The next, she was gone, only to reappear closer, standing directly in front of Rachel. "Get out," the voice whispered again, now a cold and desperate plea. "You're not supposed to be here. You're not supposed to know." Rachel's heart raced as she stumbled backward, her legs weak beneath her. The house seemed to groan and shift around her, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The temperature plummeted further, and Rachel felt the air grow thick with an oppressive, choking force. Her vision blurred as the cold seeped into her bones, and she couldn't breathe. "Please," Rachel gasped, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. She reached out, almost involuntarily, toward the figure of Lily. She needed answers. She needed to know what had happened here. Why the house seemed so alive with darkness, with pain. But as she extended her hand, the air around her seemed to pulse, a ripple of unseen energy vibrating through the room. The figure of Lily shuddered violently, her eyes flashing with an intensity that nearly paralyzed Rachel. The woman opened her mouth, and for the first time, Rachel heard a sound. An unearthly, high-pitched screech that pierced her skull. It was like 1,000 voices crying out in agony, all merging into one sound that sent waves of terror crashing over Rachel. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the noise didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic. And then, the room went completely silent. Rachel opened her eyes. The woman, Lily, was gone. The hallway was empty once more. Rachel's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she glanced around, disoriented, her breath ragged as if she had been running for miles. Her mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Had she imagined it all? Or had the house truly come alive in ways that defied explanation? Her flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but something kept her rooted to the spot. It wasn't just fear. There was something else. A pull. A need to uncover the truth. The spirit's warning echoed in her mind, but Rachel refused to leave without answers. She couldn't walk away. Not now. With trembling hands, she turned the flashlight toward the stairwell ahead of her. The darkness above seemed to stretch endlessly, pulling her toward it. Whatever lay ahead, whatever secrets the Carrington house was hiding, Rachel had to know. She wasn't leaving until she found them, The stairwell loomed before Rachel like a gaping mouth, dark and threatening. The wooden steps creaked under her weight as she ascended, each step sounding unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence of the house. The flashlight in her hand barely pierced the blackness ahead, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move and shift with every flicker of light. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back, to leave this cursed place before whatever lingered in the darkness claimed her as well. But her curiosity, her need for answers, drove her forward. The air grew colder the higher she climbed, the chill creeping into her bones like icy fingers. As she reached the top of the stairs, she noticed a door at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. The door was old, its wood warped and cracked, as though it had been locked away for decades. Rachel felt a strange pull toward it, like something in the house was guiding her to this very spot, leading her deeper into the heart of the mystery. She approached the door cautiously, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she raised her hand to touch the handle. The cold metal seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, vibrating under her fingers as if it were alive. Her mind raced with possibilities. What was behind this door? Was it the source of the house's haunting, or had Lily's spirit left something here, something Rachel needed to understand? Before she could turn the handle, the door creaked open on its own, as though welcoming her. Rachel hesitated, her pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. The temperature dropped further, and she could hear the faint sound of whispering, like a distant conversation carried on the wind. It wasn't a voice she recognized, but there was something deeply familiar about it, as though it were calling her name. With a deep breath, Rachel pushed the door fully open. The room beyond was small, its walls lined with dusty shelves that seemed to sag under the weight of forgotten memories. In the center of the room stood an old, ornate mirror, its glass cracked and darkened with age. The edges of the frame were carved with intricate patterns, some of which seemed to shift when she looked at them, as if they were alive. The air around the mirror felt thick, charged with an energy that made Rachel's skin crawl. She stepped forward, drawn to the mirror despite the dread that rose within her. Her reflection appeared hazy at first, the light from her flashlight distorting the image. But as she drew closer, the reflection became clearer, and in it, Rachel saw something she hadn't expected. Behind her, standing just inches away, was Lily. The figure was no longer a translucent ghost, but solid, her pale face twisted in a look of despair. Her eyes locked onto Rachel's, filled with pain and fear. But it wasn't just Lily's reflection that caught Rachel's attention. It was the other figure standing beside her. A man, tall and imposing, his face obscured by shadow, standing silently in the background. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she stepped back from the mirror, her heart pounding in her chest. She whipped around, but the room was empty. The man was gone. She turned back to the mirror, her hands trembling as she raised the flashlight to inspect it. The reflection remained, unchanged. Lily stood frozen, staring at her with those wide, sorrowful eyes. "What is this?" Rachel whispered to herself, the question hanging in the air. She couldn't understand what she was seeing. Why was Lily here, in the mirror? And who was the man standing behind her? Suddenly, the temperature dropped further, and Rachel felt a sharp, cold pain in her chest, like someone had thrust an icy dagger into her heart. She gasped, clutching her chest, but the pain only grew stronger. She staggered backward, but the mirror seemed to pull her in, drawing her closer with an irresistible force. Her reflection twisted, shifting in the glass, and for a moment, Rachel saw not just herself and Lily, but herself and the man, their faces frozen in time. "Leave," the voice echoed in her mind again, but this time it was louder, more desperate. "Leave now, or you'll never leave at all." Rachel could feel the walls closing in on her, the room shrinking as the mirror's presence grew stronger. The reflection of the man in the mirror seemed to move toward her, his shadowy form reaching out with long, bony fingers. A chill ran down her spine as she tried to back away, but her feet were rooted to the floor. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The air around her thickened, choking her, and the darkness from the mirror seemed to stretch out, enveloping her. Her eyes locked onto Lily's reflection, and for a moment, Rachel saw something there, something beyond the fear and sorrow. Lily wasn't just trapped in the mirror, she was warning Rachel. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the room, and the mirror shattered, its broken pieces falling to the floor like shards of ice. Rachel collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, her heart racing. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, and the chill began to recede. She looked around the room, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The man was gone. Lily was gone. But the feeling of something watching her, waiting, still lingered in the air. Rachel's pulse was still racing as she struggled to regain control of her breathing. She sat on the cold floor, her hands trembling as she wiped the sweat from her brow. Her eyes darted around the now empty room, the fragments of the shattered mirror scattered at her feet. The silence was suffocating, almost oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. But despite the absence of Lily and the shadowy figure, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lurking in the corners of the room, watching her every move. The whispering had stopped, but the echo of those cold words still lingered in her mind. "Leave now, or you'll never leave at all." Rachel had to get out. She had to. This place was cursed, its walls drenched in sorrow and suffering. She could feel it in her bones now, the heavy weight of the house's dark past, pressing down on her, threatening to pull her under. But every time she tried to move, she felt an invisible force, as if the house itself was reluctant to let her go. With a strained breath, Rachel stood up, her legs weak and unsteady. She took one last look at the room, her eyes scanning the shattered mirror fragments at her feet. She could have sworn she saw something shift in the shards, a flicker of movement, a fleeting glimpse of Lily's face. But it was gone before she could focus on it. She turned away quickly, not wanting to look back. The hallway seemed endless as she walked back, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was alive with the sound of creaking floorboards beneath her feet, the air growing colder with each passing second. The oppressive silence weighed heavily on her, and Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. That presence, the one that had been in the mirror, the one that had whispered in her mind, was still here. She could feel it in the very walls, in the oppressive air that clung to her skin. Rachel reached the bottom of the stairs, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Her flashlight flickered, casting brief shadows along the walls. She couldn't remember how long she had been in the house, or how much time had passed since Lily had first appeared to her. It felt like hours, but the clock on the wall had stopped, its hands frozen in time. The house had taken on a new, twisted life, and Rachel was its prisoner. Just as she reached for the door, the whispering began again. But this time it wasn't just in her head. It came from behind her, from somewhere deeper in the house, a soft, mournful voice that echoed through the hallway. "Why won't you leave?" it asked, the voice distorted, almost pleading. "You've seen too much. You know too much now." Rachel froze, her hand still on the door handle. She knew she had to leave, but something held her in place. She couldn't understand it. Was it guilt, fear, or something darker, something more insidious? She turned slowly, half expecting to see Lily standing there once more, but the hallway was empty. There was nothing there but the oppressive darkness. The voice came again, but this time it was different. It was no longer pleading, it was angry. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed. "Now you belong to the house." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She backed away from the door, her mind spinning, her chest tightening with panic. This wasn't just a ghost story. This wasn't some lost spirit trying to find peace. The house itself, whatever it was, whatever force lingered in its walls, had become something more. It was hungry. It needed her. It was waiting. The floor beneath her feet creaked, and suddenly, the house seemed to shift. The walls moving, closing in around her. The air grew thick, heavy with an unnatural pressure that made it difficult to breathe. The whispers grew louder, drowning out her thoughts. Her flashlight flickered and went out, plunging her into total darkness. In that moment, Rachel realized the truth. She had been drawn to the house, pulled in by something she couldn't understand. She had walked into its grasp willingly, her curiosity and her need for answers leading her deeper into its heart. And now, it was too late. The house had claimed her. It wasn't just a haunting, it was a trap. Rachel's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. She could hear the whispering now, surrounding her, closing in from all sides. The voice was no longer just in her head. It was real, coming from the walls, from the very foundation of the house. "Welcome home," the voice whispered, its tone dark and twisted. "You're one of us now." And in that moment, Rachel understood. She wasn't leaving. No one ever left the Carrington house. Not once they had been claimed. The house had won. The old factory sat at the edge of town like a decaying relic from a forgotten era. Its towering walls, coated in peeling paint, loomed ominously against the backdrop of the fading sunset. Ivy crawled up the sides, winding through broken windows like tendrils reaching for life. For years, rumors had circled the factory. Stories of ghostly figures in the windows, strange noises in the dead of night, and the tragic fire that had destroyed its heart over 2 decades ago. No one dared to go near it, except for the occasional group of thrill-seeking teenagers. But for Emma, the abandoned factory was more than just a ghost story. It was an opportunity. A freelance photographer by trade, Emma had spent her career capturing the beauty of forgotten places. Her portfolio was filled with images of crumbling mansions, derelict hospitals, and long-abandoned amusement parks. But this factory, with its dark history and untold stories, was the subject she had been searching for. She had heard the tales of its haunting, and though she tried to tell herself that it was just superstition, something about it drew her in like a moth to a flame. She couldn't resist. On a crisp October morning, Emma packed her camera gear and set off toward the factory. As she neared the site, a sense of unease crept over her. The road leading to the factory was empty, the only sound the crunch of dead leaves beneath her boots. The air felt thicker here, heavy with something unspoken. Emma paused at the gate, taking in the sight of the factory's decaying walls, the jagged outlines of broken windows, and the twisted remains of what might have once been a grand entrance. Her heart skipped a beat as she snapped a few shots of the exterior, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, adjusting the strap on her camera bag. "It's just an old building." As she made her way through the rusted gates and up the cracked path, Emma noticed strange markings on the walls, graffiti scrawled in hurried strokes. Some of it was simple vandalism, but other symbols appeared darker, more ritualistic. A chill ran down her spine. She wasn't superstitious, but something about these symbols, scratches, runes, and strange sigils felt out of place, as if they didn't belong in this world. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on her mission to capture the building's eerie beauty. The main entrance was wide open, as though inviting her in. Inside, the factory was dark, its air thick with dust and the scent of old wood and metal. The vast, empty space stretched out before her, with broken machinery scattered throughout like the bones of some long-dead creature. Faded photographs lined the walls, remnants of the factory's once thriving business. The floors creaked beneath Emma's feet, each step echoing in the silence. As she moved deeper into the heart of the factory, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She set up her camera in the center of the room, trying to capture the haunting beauty of the decaying factory. The light streaming through the broken windows cast long, eerie shadows on the floor. But just as she was about to take another shot, a noise stopped her cold. It was faint, barely audible, like the whisper of footsteps behind her. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. She spun around, camera raised, but there was nothing there. Must be the wind. She whispered to herself, trying to rationalize the sound. But as she turned back to her camera, she felt it. A cold breath on the back of her neck, icy and unnatural. Her heart skipped in her chest, and a wave of panic washed over her. She whipped around once more, but still, there was nothing. The factory was silent, save for the sound of her own rapid breathing. She took a step back, then another, her eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. And that's when she saw it. In the far corner of the room, just past the rusted metal beams, there was a figure standing in the shadows. Emma's pulse raced as her eyes locked onto it. The figure was tall, draped in shadow, and though its features were obscured, she could sense its presence, cold, watching, waiting. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper, though she was sure she was alone. No answer came. The figure didn't move. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the soft whisper of wind rattling the broken windows. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, and despite every instinct screaming at her to run, her feet felt rooted to the ground. The figure in the corner hadn't moved, but its presence seemed to fill the room, heavy and oppressive. She tried to steady her breath, reminding herself that it was probably just her mind playing tricks on her. It was an old factory after all, and shadows had a way of taking on strange shapes. "Get it together," she muttered under her breath, trying to break the tension that gripped her. But her voice sounded too small, too fragile, in the vast emptiness of the factory. She lifted her camera once more, trying to focus on the subject in front of her, but her hands were trembling so violently that she had to lower the lens to steady herself. Taking a deep breath, Emma stepped forward, inching closer to the shadow in the corner. She could see it more clearly now, tall, too tall for a human, and its edges blurred, as though it were being swallowed by the very darkness around it. The air in the room grew colder with each step she took, and the metallic scent of rust filled her nose. Her pulse quickened. There was something wrong about this, something beyond the natural. "Is someone there?" she called again, louder this time. But the figure didn't respond. The only sound now was the echo of her voice bouncing off the decaying walls. She took another step forward. Her camera hung loosely at her side, forgotten as she focused on the unsettling sight before her. Without warning, the figure moved, not in the way a person would walk, but in jerking, unnatural movements, like a marionette with strings pulled too tightly. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She froze, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The figure wasn't just standing anymore. It was slowly advancing toward her, each step deliberate and twisted. It moved as though it had been standing still for far too long, its joints clicking and popping, and Emma could hear a low, guttural sound, like an animal growling, coming from deep within its chest. The camera, now firmly in her hands, was shaking so violently that it blurred the viewfinder. But Emma couldn't look away. She should have run, should have fled from this cursed place, but she stood rooted to the spot, her legs heavy with a fear she had never known before. The figure drew closer, and in the dim light, Emma saw something that made her stomach churn. A hollow, empty face. It was human, but it was wrong. No eyes, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin, stretched over a skull that seemed to stare into her very soul. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. She could feel her throat closing up, as if the air itself had turned thick and suffocating. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but the doors she had entered through seemed miles away. The creature in front of her was close now, its shape shifting as if it were made of smoke, its form constantly undulating, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. And then, it spoke. The voice was a low whisper, just on the edge of her hearing, yet it felt as though it was inside her head, echoing with a sinister power. "Leave this place, or become one of us." The word sent a shockwave of terror through her body. Emma's body froze, her heart hammering in her chest as if it were trying to break free from her ribs. The figure's body twitched, its movements becoming faster, more erratic, as if it were reacting to her fear, feeding off it. Her mind snapped back to reality. She couldn't stay. She had to get out of here. Emma turned, her legs suddenly working again, and she sprinted toward the entrance, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the hollow building. But just as she reached the doorway, she felt a cold hand grip her arm, pulling her back with a force that nearly wrenched her shoulder from its socket. Her breath caught in her throat as she struggled, trying to break free from the thing's icy grip. But it was no use. The creature was too strong. It was stronger than anything human. She could feel its presence wrapping around her, consuming her, dragging her into the darkness. A scream finally tore its way from her throat, but it was swallowed by the walls of the factory, as though the building itself was alive, listening, waiting. With one last desperate surge of energy, Emma yanked her arm free and stumbled outside, gasping for air. She fell to the ground, her hands shaking, her heart racing in her chest as the cold night air filled her lungs. The The factory loomed behind her, silent once more, its dark windows staring down at her like empty eyes. The figure was gone. But Emma knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. It never would be. Emma stumbled to her feet, still gasping for breath, her entire body shaking. The cold night air bit into her skin, but it did little to ease the dread that settled like a weight in her chest. She glanced back at the factory, half expecting to see the figure standing at the entrance, waiting for her to return. But the building stood silent and still, its darkened windows like eyes watching her every move. The only sound was the wind rustling the leaves in the distance. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. With every step, her nerves seemed to fray further. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the oppressive silence of the abandoned factory and the endless stretch of road that lay before her. She had made it out, but somehow, it didn't feel like an escape. The figure's hollow, silent face was burned into her mind. And those words, the whisper that had crawled into her thoughts, urging her to leave or become one of them. She didn't know what it meant, but she couldn't afford to ignore it. It was hours before Emma made it back to her apartment, but sleep didn't come easily. Her mind raced with images of the factory, the figure that had come after her, the cold grip, the terrifying promise. She couldn't rid herself of the sense that she was being watched. Every creak in the building, every whisper of the wind, sent her heart into overdrive. Her mind wandered back to the strange symbols she had seen inside the factory. There had to be a connection. But to what? She had heard the urban legends, stories about the factory being cursed, about the people who had vanished there over the years. But Emma was a skeptic. She hadn't believed in ghosts or curses. Not until now. The next morning, she forced herself to focus on her work. She tried to push the experience out of her mind, thinking that perhaps it had all been a hallucination, a product of her imagination running wild in the dark. She even pulled up some of her photos from the shoot, hoping to find something that could explain what she had seen. But when she scrolled through the pictures, her blood ran cold. The figure was there. Not in every shot, but in several of them. A shadow in the corner of a room, or just barely visible in the background. It was subtle, like a trick of the light, but unmistakable, and in one particularly chilling shot, the figure was standing directly in front of her, its featureless face glaring at her from the frame. Her fingers shook as she dropped the camera on the desk, staring at the image. She couldn't deny it now. Whatever she had seen, whatever had followed her out of that factory, was real. "Maybe I'm just losing it," she muttered to herself, running a hand through her hair. But deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore it. She had to go back. There had to be an explanation. She couldn't let fear control her. That afternoon, Emma returned to the factory. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. She parked her car at the edge of the road, the factory looming ahead like a dark silhouette against the dying light. She hesitated before getting out, but the need for answers drove her forward. She had to understand what was happening, what was haunting that place. As she approached the factory, the air grew colder. She could feel it now, a shift in the atmosphere, like something ancient and malevolent was awake, watching her approach. The door she had fled through last night creaked as it swung open, as if beckoning her inside. This time, she didn't hesitate. The factory seemed even darker than it had before, the air thick with the scent of decay. The floorboards groaned beneath her weight, and the distant hum of electricity flickered through the walls like some dying pulse. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and twisting as if alive. Every corner of the building felt like it was hiding something watching, waiting. She moved deeper into the factory, her heart pounding in her chest. She was determined to find answers, but as she made her way through the dimly lit hallways, the air grew heavier. The same strange symbols were marked on the walls, but they seemed to glow now, faint lines of red that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. Her breath quickened as she reached the room where she had encountered the figure. The floor was still littered with debris, the broken machines casting long, eerie shadows across the room. And then she saw it, the figure. But this time, it wasn't just standing in the corner. It was right in front of her. Its featureless face loomed over her, its presence so overwhelming that she could feel it in her bones. It stepped closer, its form blurring like smoke, its limbs contorting in ways that were not human. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls warping as if the very building was alive, feeding off her fear. The whisper came again, louder this time, a hiss in her ear. "You're already too late." Emma stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure in front of her was no longer just a shadow. It was a presence, a living nightmare that loomed over her with unnatural stillness. Its featureless face, smooth and pale, was both terrifying and mesmerizing, as though it was something that shouldn't exist in the physical world. She could feel its energy, cold and oppressive, pressing in from all sides. The air was thick with an ancient darkness, a power so old and malevolent that it felt like it was pulling her soul out of her body. "You're already too late," the voice hissed again, its tone low and guttural, reverberating in her skull. Emma could hardly breathe. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, but her legs felt like stone, frozen in place by the oppressive presence that filled the room. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat felt tight, as if the very air in the room was choking her. She could feel the shadows closing in around her, twisting and writhing like snakes, cutting off all escape. The figure took a step toward her, its form blurring and distorting in the dim light. "Leave now," it whispered, its voice almost tender, but the words were laced with an eerie, deadly promise. "Or join us forever." The word sent a chill through Emma's core. She had seen horror before. She had visited haunted places, captured eerie images for her work. But nothing in her life had prepared her for this. She wasn't just being stalked by a ghost or some unknown entity. This place, this factory, was alive with dark energy, and whatever was trapped here wanted her to stay. Forever. Her mind raced. She couldn't let it take her. She couldn't be another name in the long list of those who had vanished here. She had to get out. But every movement felt sluggish, every breath a struggle. Her eyes darted toward the door, but it seemed so far away now, as if the factory itself had stretched out to trap her inside. The figure stepped closer, its presence becoming overwhelming. Emma could hear its breath, a sound like dry leaves rattling in the wind, and a horrible feeling twisted in her stomach. She wanted to scream, to run, to break free from this nightmare, but it was as if her body was betraying her. And then, the figure reached out. Emma flinched, but the cold, clammy hand that touched her shoulder didn't feel like the touch of a living being. It was something far worse. It felt like the touch of death itself. A frigid, empty sensation that sunk deep into her flesh, spreading like ice. Her body went rigid as a wave of cold washed over her, paralyzing her. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. She could only stand there, trapped in the grip of the figure's power. But just as the figure leaned closer, its hollow face looming over her, Emma's mind screamed for release. There had to be something she could do. In that split second, she remembered the camera. Her camera, still hanging loosely around her neck. Her fingers twitched, and with a forceful motion, she pulled it off, aiming it at the figure. Without thinking, she snapped a shot. The flash erupted in the dim room, temporarily blinding her. For a moment, the figure recoiled, as if the light had burned it. But when the light faded, it was gone. The factory was silent once more, the oppressive atmosphere lifting just enough for Emma to catch her breath. Her legs shook as she stumbled backward, still gripping her camera, her heart hammering in her chest. The factory felt less suffocating now, but she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. She could still feel the cold, lingering presence in the air, and the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the walls. Emma didn't wait another second. She ran for the door, her mind fixed on one thought: escape. She didn't look back, not once, as she sprinted through the corridors of the factory, her feet pounding against the broken floorboards. The door was in sight, and her pulse raced as she neared it. She pushed it open with all her strength, stumbling out into the open air. The factory loomed behind her, silent now, its dark windows staring at her like hollow eyes. She could feel its pull, but she didn't turn around. She ran. She ran until she reached her car, fumbling to start the engine. The engine sputtered, but finally it roared to life. Emma slammed the car into drive and sped away from the factory, her heart still racing, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. When she finally reached her apartment, she sat in the car for a long time, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. She knew she couldn't go back, not now, not ever. But something inside her whispered that the factory hadn't let her go. It was watching her, waiting. And the camera, still clutched in her hands, had captured something. The images on its screen weren't just photos, they were a warning. Whatever was in that factory wasn't finished with her yet. And she had no idea how to escape it for good. The old church had sat abandoned for years, its towering spires now mere shadows against the dark sky. Weeds crept up its cracked stone foundation, and broken windows stared out like empty eyes, their glass shattered long ago. A heavy mist clung to the ground, weaving through the overgrown cemetery next door. No one lived in the town anymore, not for miles around, and the stories about the church's past kept people away. But for 23-year-old Lena Carter, the abandoned church was more than a relic of the past. It was her project, her obsession. Lena had always been drawn to the eerie, the unexplained. A young journalist with a taste for the macabre, she'd spent most of her career documenting haunted places. The old church, though, had always eluded her. It was off-limits to the public. The local authorities insisted that it was too dangerous to enter, warning about unstable walls and toxic mold. But Lena didn't believe in such things. She knew that it was something more, something that had driven the town into hiding. She had heard the rumors for years, the whispers that the church was cursed, that a dark presence still lingered inside, something ancient and malevolent. There were accounts of strange lights in the windows at night, of eerie sounds, whispers, footsteps, even voices calling out names. The church's last minister had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a cryptic message scrawled on the altar: "The darkness never leaves." But to Lena, all of that was just noise, superstition, hysteria. She was going to uncover the truth. Armed with her camera, a notebook, and an unwavering determination, she drove to the church one chilly October evening, the setting sun casting an orange glow over the dilapidated building. It was the perfect time. The wind had started picking up, rustling the dead leaves around her feet as she approached the heavy wooden doors. Her heart raced, not out of fear, but excitement. She was on the verge of uncovering something bigger than herself. The doors creaked as she pushed them open, their sound echoing through the empty interior. The air inside was stale, thick with dust. Her flashlight illuminated the long rows of pews, their wood warped and splintered, each one a silent witness to the passage of time. The smell of mildew and decay filled her lungs as she stepped further into the building, the floorboards groaning under her weight. But there was something else in the air. A tension, a presence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Lena shook her head, trying to dismiss the sensation. "It's just the atmosphere," she told herself. "This place is just old, run down, nothing more." But as she ventured deeper into the sanctuary, the feeling grew stronger. There was something in the shadows, something watching her, waiting. She quickened her pace, heading towards the altar at the front of the room. The cracked stained glass windows, half covered in grime, barely let in any light, casting the space in a gloomy twilight. As she reached the altar, Lena felt an unnatural chill crawl down her spine. The wooden podium stood before her, its surface scratched and worn, like it had been abandoned in a hurry. She ran her fingers across the wood, her breath catching in her throat when she noticed something odd. The altar was covered in symbols, strange ancient markings that she had never seen before. Some were carved into the wood, others had been painted in blood-red ink. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the symbols. They were not of this world. They were occult, forbidden, the type of symbols reserved for rituals long since buried in history. Suddenly the temperature dropped. The air grew colder, sharper. Lena's breath fogged in the air, her pulse quickening. She turned towards the entrance, but before she could even take a step, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. She whipped around, her eyes wide with shock. She had been sure the doors were bolted shut from the outside, but now they were closed with a force she couldn't explain. The chill in the air intensified, and the faintest sound reached her ears. A whisper, like a soft murmur coming from the far corner of the church. "Lena?" She froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was soft, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. It had called her name. The sound was distant, but it was as though the church itself had whispered it, a deep, guttural tone that reverberated through the walls. She held her breath, straining her ears to hear the next sound. But when it came, it wasn't a whisper. It was a laugh. Lena's heart skipped a beat. The laugh echoed through the cold air, unnatural and chilling, as though something inhuman were mocking her. She turned, her flashlight flickering as she swept it across the room, but there was nothing there. The sound came again, louder this time, reverberating off the stone walls of the church, filling the space with a dark, eerie presence. It was a cruel, hollow laugh, almost human, but distorted in a way that made Lena's blood run cold. Her mind raced. Get out, now. The thought was sharp, urgent, but her legs felt like lead. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something more, but she couldn't seem to move. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, more alive. She forced herself to step back toward the doors, but as she did, the sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from behind her, slow and deliberate. She whipped around, her flashlight darting across the space, but the pews were empty, the altar bare. No one was there. Lena's breath quickened, panic beginning to rise in her chest. Get a grip, she told herself. It's just the wind, or maybe some animal outside. But deep down she knew that wasn't true. She had heard the footsteps. They were too deliberate, too heavy. Another whisper cut through the silence, this time coming from the very walls. Leave. Lena felt the coldness seep into her bones. She backed away from the altar, her eyes darting toward the darkened aisle leading to the rear of the church. The air was growing heavier with each passing second, suffocating her. She reached for her camera, fumbling with it in a desperate attempt to capture something, anything, that could explain the horrors she was experiencing. But before she could bring it to her eye, the ground beneath her shifted. She staggered, barely catching herself against one of the broken pews. The floor was unstable, groaning under her weight as though the very foundations of the church were shifting, waking from a long slumber. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she turned, eyes wide, scanning the dimly lit room. The shadows in the corners of the church seemed to twist, moving like smoke, creeping closer with each breath. Lena. This time, the voice was not just a whisper. It was clear, unmistakable, calling her name from behind. Her body went rigid, but she forced herself to turn around. The beam of her flashlight flickered once more, but when it illuminated the space behind her, there was nothing but empty air. The laughter came again, louder now, as if it were coming from inside her very mind. It was like a presence had crawled into her thoughts, twisting them, distorting them. She couldn't think straight. She could barely breathe. The laughter felt suffocating, pressing in on her, wrapping itself around her thoughts. Her fingers trembled as she raised the flashlight, her mind spinning with confusion and fear. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the door she had entered through. But it wasn't the same. The door, once solid and closed, was now cracked open, the darkness beyond it deeper than the night. The hallway outside seemed impossibly far, stretching on endlessly. And in the doorway, something shifted, a shadow. Her breath hitched as the figure stepped forward, emerging from the darkness like a specter. It was tall, towering over her, its shape indistinct, shifting in the dim light. The figure didn't move like a person. It glided, hovering just above the floor. The air around it shimmered, distorted, as though reality itself was bending in its presence. It had no face, no features. Just a dark mass of shadow that seemed to pulse with energy, drawing in the light from the room. Lena's heart raced as she stumbled backward, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The figure was drawing closer, and with every step, the temperature dropped, the chill seeping deeper into her bones. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it, couldn't look anywhere else as it came closer and closer. Lena. The voice came again, but it wasn't from the shadow. It was from behind her, from the pews, a new presence, colder, darker. Her breath caught in her throat, and with it the horrifying realization struck her. She was surrounded. The laughter, the whispers, the footsteps. They were coming from everywhere. Her eyes frantically searched for an escape, but there was none. She could hear the figure moving now, its presence pressing in on her from every side. She was trapped. The darkness closed in. Lena's body trembled with terror, her every instinct screaming at her to flee. But the presence surrounding her was suffocating, as though the very walls of the church had come alive, trapping her in their grasp. The cold, damp air clung to her skin, the shadows growing deeper, darker, as if they were bleeding into the room. The laughter, that cruel, hollow sound, echoed around her, bouncing off the walls, rattling her fragile grip on reality. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The more she tried to focus, the more everything slipped away. The figure in the doorway glided closer, its dark form like a shifting mass of smoke, its shape barely discernible in the flickering light. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, and she could hear her own breathing now, shallow and panicked, mixing with the sound of something else, something faint, but growing stronger. Footsteps. The same heavy, deliberate steps she had heard earlier. It's all in your head. It's just fear, Lena told herself, desperate to regain control. She forced her legs to move, stumbling back toward the altar, but every step felt like she was walking through molasses, the weight of the place pulling her down. Every muscle screamed for her to turn and run, but when she tried, she found herself rooted to the spot. Lena. The voice was a whisper, but now it felt like it was inside her head, curling into her thoughts, twisting them, feeding off her fear. A cold breath brushed her neck, making her skin prickle. Her eyes went wide with horror, and she spun around to face the source of the sensation. There was nothing behind her, nothing but the empty pews. And yet she could feel it, a presence, unseen, moving around her, pressing closer with each heartbeat. She could feel its coldness against her skin, the icy tendrils of its existence slipping into her mind, suffocating her thoughts. I need to get out. I need to leave. Her heart pounded louder in her ears, the sound of it drowning out everything else. She knew she had to run. The door was just a few feet away. All she needed to do was reach it. But as she took a step, the floor beneath her feet groaned, the wood creaking ominously. The sound was like a warning, a death knell, and she froze mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. It's not real. It's not real. It's just a church. An old church, Lena repeated to herself, trying to banish the creeping dread that clawed at her insides. But the words didn't help. The air grew heavier, more oppressive. It was like the church itself was alive, feeding on her fear, twisting the space around her. And then the shadow moved. It wasn't a figure anymore. It had become something else, an enormous swirling mass of darkness, its edges flickering like smoke, its presence suffocating. The shadow lunged toward her with a speed that made her stomach drop. She didn't even have time to scream. It was upon her in an instant, engulfing her in a cold, suffocating darkness. She gasped, unable to breathe, as if the air itself had been stolen from her lungs. The church, the walls, everything, it all seemed to twist and bend, becoming a dark, oppressive void. She could feel the weight of it, the force of it pressing down on her chest, making her heart pound harder and harder until it seemed like it would explode. Lena. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a growl, deep and guttural, vibrating through her very bones. The dark mass seemed to pulse with life, and Lena realized with a sickening sense of dread that it was feeding off her fear. That laugh, that awful mocking laugh, filled her ears again, as if the shadow was taunting her. With all her strength, Lena threw herself forward, her body trembling, her breath ragged as she sprinted toward the door. Her feet pounded against the floor, and her mind screamed at her to keep moving, to not stop. The laughter echoed behind her, growing louder, as if the very walls of the church were closing in on her, pushing her forward, making escape feel impossible. She was so close. She could almost taste freedom. But just as she reached the door, she felt it. The cold hand. A freezing grip clamped around her wrist, and she screamed, the sound caught in her throat as the shadow surged forward, swallowing her once more. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the world around her plunged into darkness. Lena's heart raced as the darkness closed in around her. She was trapped. The cold hand that gripped her wrist tightened with an unnatural force, and she tried to pull away, but the pressure was unyielding. She spun, her flashlight useless in the black void, trying to locate the source of the grip that had held her so tightly. The shadows swirled around her, making it impossible to see anything clearly. The air was thick with a stench of decay, and every breath felt like it could be her last. "Let me go," she cried, her voice strained and desperate. She yanked at her wrist again, but the grip was relentless. The chill from the shadow was creeping through her skin, spreading through her arm and down to her fingertips. It was as though the very essence of the church was pulling her in, suffocating her, feeding on her fear. She could hear it again, the low, guttural laugh. It seemed to come from every direction, echoing off the walls, bouncing off the stone and wood surrounding her. But this time the laugh wasn't mocking, it was hungry. A deep, awful hunger that vibrated through her chest, reverberating through her bones. "Who's there?" Lena gasped, her voice barely audible. "Show yourself." But there was no response, no answer, except for the dark void that pressed in on her. The walls of the church seemed to grow closer, closing in from all sides, suffocating her. She could feel the temperature plummet even further, until it felt as if her breath was freezing in the air. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, groaning like a living thing, and Lena's knees buckled as she collapsed to the floor. Her chest tightened, her heart racing as she struggled to breathe. The grip on her wrist pulled her up with such force that her body jolted painfully. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. The darkness was all-encompassing now, swallowing the light, swallowing her very soul. The shadow around her grew, thickening, its shape shifting, like a living, breathing entity. "Help me," she whispered, barely able to speak. The words felt like a prayer, like a plea to something that might listen, but she wasn't sure if there was anything left to save her. And then, as suddenly as the darkness had come, it began to dissipate. The shadows retreated, pulling away from her like the tide. But Lena didn't feel the relief she expected. Instead, she felt as if she were being drawn deeper into something. Her vision blurred, her body light and unsteady, as though the very ground beneath her had vanished. A low voice, so faint she could barely hear it, whispered in her ear, "It's too late for you." Lena tried to scream, but the sound was caught in her throat. The floor below her shifted again, and this time, it wasn't just the building groaning. She felt it, a pressure, a pull, a force so strong it nearly ripped the air from her lungs. Her feet lifted from the floor as if gravity had been turned off, and she was floating in the cold, empty space. "Let go," she cried out, her voice panicked, desperate, but it was as if her words had no weight, no power. The pressure increased, forcing her toward the altar. As she approached, she could feel the oppressive weight of the presence that had haunted this place for so long. Her legs kicked out, trying to find ground, but there was nothing. Only darkness. The altar loomed before her, and as her body was pulled closer, Lena saw the symbols etched into the wood, the strange markings from earlier. They pulsed with an eerie light, like veins of darkness coursing through the wood itself. The symbols seemed to come alive, shifting, changing, as if they were watching her, waiting for something. Faha. Lena's body collided with the altar, and a burst of cold shot through her chest as she was slammed against the old wood. Her head spun, her vision flickering as the darkness closed in again. But through the haze of fear and confusion, she heard a voice, one that wasn't her own. "You belong to us now." It was a whisper, but it cut through her like a blade. The words sank into her, cold and sharp, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. The shadows, the laughter, the whispers, they had all been leading her here to this moment. And now she realized with horror, it was too late. She wasn't escaping. She wasn't going anywhere. The church had claimed her, and somewhere, deep within its crumbling walls, the darkness whispered its victory. The doors, once so solid and unreachable, opened to reveal the void beyond. There would be no way out. The church had won.